welcome back to Methodist Mondays. I am Pastor Liz.
And I'm Pastor Mick.
And I'm Reverend Haven.
And this week we will be talking a little bit about the history of Methodism, because we can't know what we are and who we are without knowing where we come from. And so we'll dive a little bit into, like, where did this all originate? Like, where do we come from? Who started it, and all of these things. Now, you may know the names John and Charles Wesley, but do you know who they are or why they're important? So we'll start with a little bit of them and their background. And Mick, if you will, just go ahead and lead us in.
Sure. So when I think of John and Charles, I can't help but first thinking about their mother, Susanna. Susanna raised John and Charles and 7 other children with a strict plan of how they should live out their faith. They were raised to read the Bible daily. And they actually had interviews one-on-one with their mom to see, all right, what are you learning? What are you reading about today? They were raised to not eat in between meals. Their lives were strict, but for a purpose. She wanted to implement this accountability within their family and with each other. Susanna was married to Samuel Wesley, who was an Anglican priest. And so John and Charles were surrounded by faith by their father and their mother. And I think that would prove to be apparent throughout their lives as they would go to Oxford and to start this movement that we now call Methodism.
Yeah, like you said, I think Susanna is super important to our history. We even commonly refer to her as the mother of Methodism. So, like you said, she has a really strong religious background, but she comes from a Puritan culture, right? Like, her grandfather and her father are both leaders in their faith communities, but when they encourage her to be educated. So she spends a lot of time in her father's library reading the books there, and continues to be educated on the issues that are happening in her life and around them. And then as she becomes like the head of the household, or her household, she continues to teach her kids, like you're talking about. But she's also known for her teachings in the community. She teaches from her kitchen. People are coming from all over to hear what she has to say. She's talking about Bible study and how the Bible applies to their lives and how they live and whatnot. And I can just see them there, all like in her kitchen, and the kids running around and everybody gathered around hearing what she has to say. She's even known like better than some men in the community, as just because of her ability to teach and understand and help others understand. And so she continues on in this method. Like, she, even in letters as her sons go off to school, she like is writing to them, always encouraging them to dig deeper and to consider what the Bible has to say and how it applies to their lives. And so, we know that about her. Another interesting fact about her is that, like I said, she's very she's very knowledgeable about critical issues that are happening around them. And so, like, Methodism doesn't come to be in a bubble, right? Like, she's a Jacobite. So she is living in a very political climate. And so all of these things that are happening are being navigated even in times of high politics and whatnot. So, like, what that means is that she had to pick a side. And so, like other Anglicans, she chooses the Jacobite side, and what their uproar is about the monarchy. And so, like, there's just a lot going on in the world. And so, as you know, as we think about being Methodists, one of the really unique things about Methodism is it's a very practical theology. It is formed over several lifetimes. Like, what we believe doesn't come from an isolated bubble, like a think tank. It's happening throughout the lives, and it continues to grow and become what it is. And so, I think that this is applicable for us because we also live in a high political environment, and we have a lot of things going on in our world, but we also have to think about, how does this apply to our lives, and like, how are we practicing our faith on a daily basis? And she really is the base for that.
Yeah, Yeah, I agree. I think when we look at Susanna and we look at the Wesleys, I think we see that they were not trying to start a new faith. They were not trying to start a new denomination or religion. They were working within their church and trying to revitalize it. They were members of the Church of England, and they wanted to make the Church of England the best that it could be. They weren't just saying in a bubble, as you said, like, all right, let's make a new faith. And I think that we can learn from that. And I think that we can see, all right, what can we do in our own churches? How can we help to revitalize our own churches as we follow into this tradition of trying to be the best that we can be?
Yeah, so from here, from their upbringing, where do they go from here? How does the Methodist movement really begin? Haven, can you get us there?
Yeah, so after they grow up, the boys, John and Charles, head off to college, and they are your role model Christian college students. Charles actually starts a club called the Holy Club, and John is invited into this club. And this is just a small group that gathers together to share their faith and their spiritual practices with one another. So they have membership vows in this club as well. That's to lead holy lives, to pray daily, to take communion weekly, and to visit prisons regularly. And so this is a way that they are able to hold each other accountable, but also to grow in their faith and what they feel called to. And so this is where we see the beginning of the social holiness emphasis that the Wesleys really provide, because we need each other in our faith as well. We don't have to do it alone. But it's also a way, this group was, this is where the term Methodist comes from. So because they were so method and structure, like methodical and structure like, people actually called them Methodists, making fun of them. However, in this day, who knew the term would stick to be a denomination?
Yeah, that makes me think, as people who are called Methodists today, we have our own vows, right? We have membership vows. We have vows to become elders and deacons. And I wonder if our vows should sound more like the vows that John and Charles and the Holy Club had. Just kind of thinking out loud. I want to ask you guys, I don't know, do you think that our vows should look more like the Holy Club vows?
I mean, I think you're calling the church out there a little bit when you ask that question, and maybe calling us out. So I think that we have our membership vows that we take that are very broad and meaningful, but they kind of cover everything. They're not as detailed that you have to go to prison this time this week to visit people, or you have to go to the hospital to do this time and this visitation. They're more broad so that our spiritual gifts can be highlighted, and we can use those according to how we feel called to ministry in whatever way that is. I think that we can learn from the practical ways that the Holy Club's vows, we can learn those to know, okay, we took a general vow, but how can we add some practical ministry in our lives? And that's what we can learn from the Holy Club.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Haven. What she's saying, I mean, like the Methodist vow is to renounce the evil forces of wickedness and in whatever way that they present themselves. And so, like Haven said, these are very broad. They're very general, but I think that they are rooted in the work that John and the men of the Holy Club were doing. I think that this is where we know that, that instillment that Susanna did of accountability. We know that all of these things are very important for us to know, first of all, what we stand for, and to know like that we have, it matters how we live our lives. And I know that that's deeply enriched here, but I think that through the years, there's been a lot of development that has like made these more and more broad and taken off the emphasis on the more direct, the directness of what the Holy Club vows had. But I think we can learn a lot from that. I think, the emphasis on daily prayer, the emphasis on communion, and the way we live our lives, and how important that it matters, how we show up in our world. So I do think that it's stepping on our toes a little bit, but I think that we can probably grow a little bit from knowing this and knowing where it comes from.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you're spot on. Where we don't necessarily have to be as specific as John and Charles were, but we do need to be just as practical. In our vows, I think a lot of times we just view them as things that we say once and forget about. But yeah, if we can be practical about that, I think that can change the world.
And it does for them and for us. I mean, like from here, this is where we everything bounces off of their time in Oxford, right? So like, where does it go from here? Well, John and Charles Wesley both graduate from Oxford and become Anglican priests. And in their study from there, well, it just kind of rockets off. So Hayden, like, what happens next?
Yeah, so the boys graduate, and they decide to head to America. John has been called to be a missionary, a volunteer missionary, and so they are on the boat over to Georgia is where they will begin their ministry. But while on the way, John has never been on a boat before, and there are storms that are over the Atlantic, and he is panicking. He thinks this is the end. This is how we die. What do we do here? And so the storms are coming, and he meets a group called the Moravians, and they are a different belief, like a faith belief background. And so they are just calm as these storms are coming. And John is like, how are you calm? Like, we're sinking. But so they're calm, and they're like, we have no need to worry. Like, we don't fear. We know God's got this. And so for there, it starts to spark in John that makes him realize, I've been doing the structure and the method of faith, but I still am missing something in my relationship with God. However, they do make it safely to Georgia, and John begins preaching in Georgia, and he's preaching to some Native American tribes. However, his preaching career doesn't really take off well in Georgia. They aren't very big fans of it. It's too structured because he's still missing that feeling aspect of it. And so he's not very popular as a pastor or as a preacher there, and things just aren't really going well for him so far.
Yeah, and you're talking about he wasn't very successful in his ministry in Georgia, and he definitely was not successful when it came to his dealings with women. So one of the things that happened when he first got to Georgia, he became smitten with a girl. This girl was named Sophie Hopkey, and he describes her in a letter like this: the attractive niece of the chief magistrate of Savannah. So this is someone who he really thinks he could have a future with, but there is something in the way. John is the pastor at the church that Sophie is a member of. And so with that, they try to keep it under wraps. They're not sure. It's a kind of if they will, if they won't thing. And John eventually, he tells Sophie, I don't think that you should get married. I think for your spiritual well-being, it'll be best if you remain single. And well, Sophie, she takes that as well. That means you're not going to marry me, so I'm going to find someone else who will. And so Sophie comes back to the church later with a husband and a ring around her finger. So when John sees this, he is not too happy about it, and he refuses to serve Sophie communion. And that's not something that would be taken very lightly. In fact, John is forced to stand trial in a defamation suit against Sophie, because not allowing communion means that she is somehow not a good enough Christian for that. And them's his fighting words back then. And so John eventually escapes and doesn't go to trial, and goes back to England. So it's not successful at all, actually, in many parts of his missionary journey to America. And I think it's a good reminder that this guy who was the founder of Methodism was not very successful in some aspects of his life.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a reminder for us that we can look, and at times we're going to fail in our lives as well, or in a relationship with God, or in a certain ministry, but we can take heart in knowing that it still worked out for John, and God's going to make it work out for us. It may not seem like it at times, but don't be afraid of failure, because we just got to keep trusting God in whatever situation, who's going to bring good out of any situation.
Yeah, and this is true for John and for Charles. Both of them later have experiences, but I think that, you know, sometimes we fail, and God takes those failings and brings something else beautiful out of them. So John is back in London, and God has brought him back, and he continues to go to church and develop his faith. And I mean, it's just a few days later, and you know that prayer meeting, or that gathering of the Holy Club, was interesting because John had some things to account for. But anyway, so like they get back together, and he's still on his faith journey, and they're in Aldersgate in London. He's at a meeting, and he has this experience of assurance of salvation. This is what he had been missing on the boat with the Moravians, right? Like this is the heart piece. And like he calls this, in his own words and how we know it today, is this is the moment when his heart is strangely warmed, and he's assured of his salvation, and he knows that God is with him, and like that, you know, from here, this is the moment where things really begin to blossom, right? And like all of his writings and his brother's writings, and like these moments where they really encounter the Holy Spirit, and in their faith journeys, like they continue to grow and to encourage others and to build these societies. And so next week, we'll talk a little bit about how that blossoms so much, and it comes back to America, right? And it takes off. So we'll talk a little bit about Methodism in America. But now we have to note, from here, John Wesley is going to write over 40,000 sermons. Over 40,000. And then Charles is going to write over 6,000 poems, or hymns as we know today, and some that we still sing today, right? Like Hark the Herald Angels Sing, or Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. There are so many different ways that we're going to continue to take off from here. So I hope you'll join us back next week, and please post your questions. We want to work those in, but let's see how Methodism takes off in America.